Thank you all so much for coming today. We're very excited to have Todd with us today to talk about handheld precision cameras and do a virtual gallery talk for us. Our next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, September 1st, and we'll have process historian Mark Osterman demonstrating combination printing and actually talking through the process and showing it in the darkroom. So that will be September 1st. The talk that we're having today is partially sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the NEH CARES grant. And we're very grateful to them for the funding so that we can keep doing all of these online talks and make this available for free to everyone. This talk is also thanks to members and donors. Without our membership and without our donors, we wouldn't be able to do events like this, and we are grateful for their support. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd to start us on our virtual gallery tour.
Thank you, Kate. Well, to get started, first of all, I'd like to, again, thank you for joining us today. We've been having a slight bit of trouble with my computer camera. Oddly enough, it's part of what I was going to talk about today was auto exposure. So unfortunately, I don't have yet to figure out how to fool a camera and a computer. I'm actually in the vault next to some of our studio stand cameras. So again, we thank the NEH for their support. I wish we had a better camera to use to do the talk with. So such is the way it goes. And again, this talk is possible due to our members and donors who support us. I'd also like to thank my home office manager, Titan, who's claiming to be logging in as we speak. Hopefully he'll have a little better luck with technology than I'm having today. So the technology collection consists of about 17,000 objects, probably half of which are cameras, and we are a mechanical engineering heritage collection designated by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. We're actually the only collection that is so designated. Most of what they would designate would be, I don't know, power plants and dams and large bridges and things of that type. So it's a very honorable distinction for us to have. So photography really started with the Daguerreotype camera. August 19th is World Photography Day, and that has to do with the fact that that's the day that the Giroux system was introduced to the public. Now, this is by no stretch of the imagination a handheld camera. It's roughly, oh, I would say 16 inches by 18 inches, the whole kit weighs about 70 pounds. You're not going to hand carry this, but you don't have photography without the Giroux, and again, World Photography Day is in honor of the Giroux. Early photographic processes, so we're talking about the daguerreotype and the wet plate process, involved quite a bit of chemistry that the photographer had to do. So the photographer actually had to be both the artist and the chemist. The reason I get into this, again, it really has to do with how photography works. It originally was a chemical reaction, if you would. So you're really trying to capture and save the image that you would see in the camera obscura, which is sort of what the Giroux is. It's sort of a tuned up version, if you would. Now, the original process, the exposure time would have been 15 minutes long. So obviously, the other problem with a handheld camera is you have to have a shutter, a mechanical shutter of some sort. It was possible to do this with collodion eventually. There's somewhat debate as to what the first handheld camera is. Some claim it is the pistolgraph from 1859. This is a palm-sized camera. It doesn't really look like it's hand-holdable, but this little box actually would fit in the palm of your hand. And it's the first camera with a mechanical shutter. You notice that the barn doors on the front of the camera, those would actually be actuated by an elastic band. Sort of the more traditional, if traditional is the right word, people thinking the Thompson revolver camera being the first handheld camera, it somewhat resembles a revolver, and you can see it actually has a hand grip on the back. The shutter and the plate would be in the lower part of the camera. You actually raise the lens to focus, and you drop it down to take the pictures, and then it will continue to fall to the bottom after the picture is completed. The shutter is a rotating disc, 1862. The photobinocular, obviously also a handheld camera. This used dry collodion plates. One of the flavors of collodion, if you would, instead of using it as a wet plate process, you could dry it. The images or the sensitized material was less light sensitive. The magazine on the top actually held a number of plates that you would rotate through. The viewfinder over the magazine, or is on above the magazine. Let's try this again. The viewing lens is on the, as you would hold this on the left, the taking lens is directly below the magazine on the right. So the sensitized material would drop into the camera. You'd take the plate, then you'd have to turn it back upside down to make it fall back out. Kind of a complicated way to do, but it would allow you to basically do the equivalent of tourist photography. So you can take multiple pictures with one load. There's a big change that comes in 1880 when George Eastman and a number of other manufacturers introduced gelatin dry plates. This was pre-sensitized materials you could purchase, so you didn't have to do that. They were dry, so you could actually take your pictures and then get them processed at a later time when it was more convenient for you to do. After the 1880s and the introduction of gelatin dry plates, we start seeing all sorts of camera innovations that happen. Some of it are handheld box cameras and things of that type. The other innovation that happens around this time is 1885, we have Eastman's American film. This is a paperback stripping film that could be applied to pre-existing cameras. Part of Mr. Eastman's plans was that. He wanted to originally create sensitized materials that you could go into either his roll holders, which is what the roll film would use for, or for the dry plates, but again, which would fit into other cameras. So, box camera-wise, the Schmidt detective camera is usually considered to be one of the first handheld gelatin dry plate cameras. This particular example is also fitted with Eastman's roll film, so it would use, like we said before, the packaged paperback roll film, or it could be fitted for the gelatin dry plates. 1885. This is a waist level camera. You can see it has a rather nice, convenient carrying handle on the top. Also around this time, you start seeing other manufacturers making roll film. Stebbings automatic camera used a roll film. This was a collodion-based roll film. It worked reasonably well, except it had one slight problem, is that the images were not dimensionally stable, so they would kind of stretch a little bit. Again, this is sort of the fun of working the bugs out, sort of like my auto exposure camera in my notebook computer here. The really big change in this is the Kodak camera, officially introduced in 1888. The particular example that we're looking at here is a pre-production sample. This is serial number 6. It's the oldest one known. This was a camera that was basically built to test the process out, if you would. The camera used Eastman's American film. This is the paperback stripping film. It actually used a paper support with a gelatin image on the paper. You'd actually have to float the image off for processing, believe it or not. This is actually a very rare box of the film itself. The camera, generally speaking, came loaded with 100 exposures of film. Look like this. This is number 81, serial number 81, which I'm dating in July 1888, which is when the camera commonly went on sale. So it came loaded with 100 exposures. So the camera cost $25, including the 100 exposures. And it was fairly simple to use. You basically use the little tulip tie on the top, you lift that up, that actually cocks the shutter, the little button on the side trips the shutter speed is around a 25th of a second, lens was f9. So for this you get 100 exposures, and at the end of it you would actually send the entire camera back for processing and reloading. This slide shows the camera's viewfinder. The one card, the front side of the card, shows the angle of view. It was also etched into the camera on the later models, and the exposure counter, which is numbered 1 through 100, and obviously you cross them off. And needless to say, this still works today. You can still cross them off if you want. I would encourage you to do this one because it's actually one of the original ones. The pictures were pretty much the sorts of things that in some ways you'd see today. They're circular images, 2.5 inches in diameter. This happens to be a parade taken about 1889, and this is an albumen print. The camera was advertised in non-traditional photographic publications. Here you see it in the publisher's scrapbook. It was also advertised around the world. This particular advertisement looks like it's in French, or pardon me, it looks like Spanish. The next year, '89, Eastman introduced the nitrate film. They called it transparent film, and this is basically what would be used as film base for many, many years to come. The first camera that used Kodak's film, per se, is the Esco PET, another handheld camera. Again, this whole camera and gun theme sort of shows up, sort of a nice handheld looking handle on the bottom. Improvements start happening quite rapidly. The Camerette 1891 does a rather interesting thing. It actually does two things that the Esco PET didn't have. The roll holder is actually built into the camera, making it a little bit smaller, and it also has a viewfinder on the top, which comes in really quite handy when you're trying to take snapshots. The folding Kodak basically does exactly what the earlier camera did, except it's a bigger camera. This makes a 4x5-inch image, and it's basically is a folding camera. You can sort of fold it up, and it sort of resembles the size of a fairly large handbag. Trying to make things smaller. This is a folding strut camera made in France. It's a bag bellows camera, which is the front is extended by the wires that go around the side, and you can see that it has two rather interesting things. It has a very primitive viewfinder on the top, and it also has a between the lens shutter that's actuated by two rather interesting springs, coil springs. Obviously, that's a little complicated. What really starts to simplify things is the folding pocket Kodak. This is the first version, 1897. Folding cameras would be around for roughly the next 60 years or so. It makes it a lot more convenient. This particular camera uses a paper-backed roll film, which had been around for the last probably 5 or 6 years, 1887, and it also incorporates a waist-level viewfinder. Getting into rather other interesting ways of doing things, we have the Artist twin lens reflex camera. This uses gelatin dry plates, but it has a rather novel idea, is it actually has two lenses on the camera. The top lens is for viewing, and the bottom lens is for taking the picture. This style of camera would become quite popular with portrait photographers. It has the advantage of, unlike reflex cameras, which you'll see just in another slide or so, the photographer does not lose sight of the subject when you're taking the picture. One of the more interesting advances in cameras is the Pascal 1899. This used a spring motor for film advance. So it's a roll film camera with a winding key on the bottom. It also has a folding eye level, what we would call a Newton finder. So what you do with this camera is you load it with the film, you close the back, you take the handle on the bottom and you crank it, it winds the film all the way to the end. It also winds up the spring motor, and when you take the picture, the film advances back into the cartridge. Rather novel idea, 1899. The Segrist was really kind of a classic camera, really quite classic in the fact that it has a very high shutter speed of about a 1/1200th of a second, which is really quite fascinating, especially given the fact that the film from this time period, sensitivity, this is actually a dry plate camera, the sensitivity would be something in the vicinity of, say, ASA, well, we'll be generous, 5. So trying to use a 1/1000th of a speed shutter with a film that slow is going to be rather, I don't know, unlikely, but it's certainly a novel idea of being able to make a mechanical shutter go that fast. The RB cycle graphic is kind of a combination, could be used on a tripod or handheld. It does have a waist level finder. This sort of catches on with people who like to go bicycling. That's why it's called a cycle graphic. Actually would fit into a case and could be attached to the middle bar of a bicycle. It also has heavy influence on what will become the speed graphic camera in about 15 years down the road from here. Soho Tropical Reflex. This is the single lens reflex camera. This was made in England. It's a rather exotic camera that's made out of teak wood with a really nice Russian red leather. So you're going to actually be able to see exactly what's going to be recorded on the film, or in this case, dry plates, with the exception of the exact moment of when you take the picture. There's actually a mirror in there that sort of blocks the view. You're actually using this viewing from the top. So when you take the picture, the mirror actually moves out of the way so the film can actually see the picture, if you would. 1905. In the United States, the former swing division of Eastman Kodak Company introduces the press Reflex in 1908. Basically, it's a very similar camera to the Soho. Fairly good size. This camera is 5x7 plates, so it's a fairly good size camera. This was actually used by press photographers, both sports photographers at the time, and was popular really for the next 20 or so years again. This is carrying a fairly good sized box around. This is weight is going to be somewhere around 10-12 pounds, and it's almost the same size as the photographer, if you would. It's a big piece of hardware to carry around. Smaller version of, really more for amateur photographer, was the 1A Reflex. 1A refers to the film size, if you would, image size. It would be what we'd call today, or fairly soon after this, 1/16 film. It's going to make a picture that's roughly 2.5 by 4.25 inches in size. It does fold up, kind of a nice little reflex camera, if you would. The key on the one end advances the film, and the key on the other side winds up the shutter, believe it or not. It's a spring shutter. And we also have its sort of, I don't know, half sibling, the Speed Kodak. It's basically about the same camera, but without the reflex feature. So if you wanted to have something a little smaller to carry around, Speed Kodak would have been a good choice. The RB Auto Reflex starts to catch on with photographers other than press people. This is a little bit smaller. It's a 4x5 camera. This particular one belonged to Alfred Stieglitz, was given to the museum by Georgia O'Keeffe. And again, it's a waist level handheld single lens reflex camera, 1910, and the Reflex type cameras were made up into the 1950s. If we like the smaller folding, almost eye level cameras, if you would, this miniature clap, clap means folding in German, really kind of a nice camera. Newton Finder, that's the viewfinder on the top. It's sort of an eye level camera, but these were designed to actually be used at arm's length, so you actually would fold it out here or so when you use the camera, 1913. 35 millimeters starts to show up. If you kind of track this back, the film from the Kodak was 70 millimeters wide. So when Thomas Edison started doing experiments with motion pictures, they took the film from the Kodak, which was 70 millimeters wide, slid it in half, perforated it, and that's where 35 millimeter motion picture film came along. So the motion picture film industry had somewhat of a surplus of film, if you would. So you could actually purchase leftover loads, which could be used in the Tourist Multiple and the Simplex. The Simplex and the Tourist Multiple are very similar cameras. The one difference is the Tourist Multiple makes a picture that's half the size of a standard, what we now consider a standard 35 millimeter frame in still photography, which is 24 by 36. In the motion picture world, they consider that to be full frame, which would be 18 by 24. The Simplex allowed you to make either side, so you could actually change the gate, if you would, where the film goes through, so you could do either full frame 35 millimeter in still photography lore, which is 36 by 24, or half frame, which is 18 by 24. I like to say that the best camera is the one you have with you. So the idea of the vest pocket Kodak shows up, originally introduced in 1912. This is a camera that used 127 roll film. Image size is 4.5 by 6 centimeters, or roughly 1.5 by 2 in English measuring systems. This particular one is the new and improved autographic version, and it was given to the museum by Ansel Adams. It was actually his second camera. So we're starting to look at high technology, if you would, advances in cameras. And one of the first things that comes along is the coupled rangefinder, introduced with the 3A folding autographic Kodak Special Model B Plus rangefinder in 1916. This allows the photographer to very accurately determine the distance between the camera and the subject. This is important due to the fact that, again, film is pretty slow at this time period. you know, we're still looking at well, we'll bump it a little bit. We'll say somewhere around 10, 12. So you're going to shoot most of your pictures with the lens wide open, which doesn't give you a whole lot of depth of field, especially on a larger format like this. This makes a postcard size image, which is, let's see, 3 1/4 by 5 1/2. Another nice little handheld camera is the Paul Bell Machina. This folds up, it becomes fairly small. It makes a 6 by 9 centimeter image on either dry plates or 120 roll film. Mentioned the speed graphic a few minutes ago. This is the first version of the speed graphic, the top handle. It also has a flash bulb, which would be introduced in 1929. Automatic ANSCO. This has motorized, again, a spring motorized film advance, but for paperback roll film. The Erminox. This is designed to make existing light photos. It has a very fast lens. The original version had a 1.8 and then later an f2 lens. Fairly fast lens for the time period. It would allow you to, again, sort of make existing light photos, meaning without flash. And again, you got to keep in mind that the film is pretty slow at this time period. You're probably bumping up to, say, 20 to 30 or so at this time period. Like a Newton finder, again, is intended to be held at arm's length. The Leica Model A sort of sets the standard for what a 35mm camera should look like and how it should work. It has shutter speed dial on the top, a nice little telescoping viewfinder on the top. Also, film advance and film rewind, uses 35mm film. Really sort of set what we'd say the gold standard, if you would, and this is the gold model. This happens to be a replica of the Leica Lexus. So again, something that was so well thought of, they would actually gold plate them. The gold version, by the way, is incredibly rare. Talked a little bit about twin lens reflex. Company in Germany, Franke and Heidecke, sort of popularized it with the Rolleiflex Model 1, 6 by 6 centimeter image on 120 roll film. The twin lens reflex would remain in production for the next 50 plus years. Coupled rangefinder again. This is the Klaus Peggy. This is the first 35 with a coupled rangefinder, to soon be followed up by the Leica 2 Model D in 1932. Again, with small film especially, you're going to be using large apertures fairly often. Knowing or having the accurate distance measured between the subject and the camera is very important. Sort of continuing down that same line, we have the Contax 1. Basically very similar to the Leica in some ways, although it has a wider base rangefinder. Wider base is going to be more accurate. It had a faster lens. This is an f1.5 sonar lens, uncoated, and also a shutter that would go much faster. This used a horizontal travel, let's make this vertical travel shutter, which would go up to 1/2000th of a second. Let's check that. Let's say 1200th of a second, 1932. So we're going to start talking about a little more about exposures again. So this is the Voigtlander Promenade, and this has one rather interesting feature. Well, first it has two features. It does have a coupled rangefinder in it, but it also has a light meter. Now this is not built in, so it's an extinction type meter, but it does help you determine the exposure rather than just saying, oh, I don't know, f8 and whatever shutter speed I think should be used, around a 60th of a second, something like that. This has a light meter built in, so we're starting to get into the high technical things, if you would, relative to cameras. Another 35 with coupled rangefinder is the Super Nettle. This is an interesting camera in that it's a coupled rangefinder and the camera folds, really quite nice. We're going to look at a little bit of innovation in cameras. One is the Retina 1. It comes out in 1934. It's basically George Eastman wanted to acquire a company that made high quality cameras out of Germany. If you start kind of looking at where cameras are made, started out in France and England, eventually moved to the US and Germany. Germany was sort of the home of the high quality technical cameras. So Eastman wanted to get on board with that. And with the Retina is also the Kodak magazine, the 35mm film magazine. So the one that we're showing here is actually the first version with the two dimples that hold the ends of the canister together. The next thing that happens in photography, again, not a camera, but it's an advancement in film. This is Kodachrome color film. It's one of the first color films available, 1935. This happens to be the 35mm version of that. So with color film, eventually we're going to start having another problem, is that we have a Context here, Context 2, you see wide-base rangefinder, fairly fast lens. If you look at that lens, it looks pretty much clear. This does not have any lens coating on it. So when you get into color films, lens coating becomes very critical to have. It really works much better with color films. It also starts to cut down in internal reflections. If you look at the lens, in fact, on this picture, you can actually see all of the elements because the light that's used to illuminate this for the picture is reflecting off the glass inside that lens. So when you take pictures with this, depending on where the camera is pointed, if it's pointed anywhere near the sun or a light source, you will also get that kind of reflection on the picture. This is the pre-anniversary speed graphic, 1937. This was a new and improved model, if you would. Pretty easy to identify in that it has gray hardware on it. These are not real common cameras. It has a coupled rangefinder that's an add-on piece, 1937. We call it the pre-anniversary because the anniversary comes out a little bit later. They just called it the speed graphic, trying to come up with a way to differentiate it from the one that they also called the speed graphic that had the top handle on it. Again, pocket-sized photography. Minox comes out in 1937. This used a fairly small film, 9.5mm. This is something that you could put in your pocket. Eventually, it's sort of associated with spies, if you would. But the original plan was to come up with something that was pocket-sized. Also, in the small pocket-sized camera, we have the Sola. It sort of out-Minoxes the Minox, if you would, and the fact that it has interchangeable lenses. Zeiss Super Iconta B is probably in the top 20 or so of the really interesting high-tech cameras from the day. This is a 120 roll film camera. It's a folding 120 rangefinder camera, and these would have been made for another 20 years or so. Quite popular with travel photographers, and due to the image size, big size, 6x6 centimeters, made a pretty high-quality photograph. The Kinney Exacta 1 is the first 35mm single lens reflex camera. Comes out in 1937. And if you look at this camera, you'll say, wow, it's really interesting, but there's one other really fascinating thing about this. Other than it's the first SLR, it also has a coated lens on it. If you look at the lens, you can see it has a little bit of a bluish cast to it, and there also in the lens itself, you see a red letter T. That means it's a coated lens. Coated lenses are really a huge advance in photography. So getting into Japan, we have the Canon S. This is a 35mm rangefinder camera, sort of akin to the Leica. To get around the Leica patents, it actually has a pop-up viewfinder. So 35mm photography is starting to be kind of a thing here. Pocket-sized photography, one of the most technically advanced is the Compass. This is sort of what else can you throw at a small camera. It's a pocket-sized camera. It has a coupled rangefinder. The gizmo that sits on the top of the camera is actually an indexing head, so you can actually take panoramic photographs with it. It also telegraphs or telescopes down, so it's a very, very small size camera and quite technically advanced for the time. Super Kodak 620 is the first camera that does automatic exposure. The funny window with the grid pattern just above the lens there is the CDS cell. So basically what they did is they connected the aperture of the lens, believe it or not, to a voltmeter that's reading the energy from the CDS cell. So that's actually making the change. So you set the shutter speed and the camera sets the aperture. Really pretty advanced for its day. These cameras were fairly rare. I think they only produced about 250 of them. It became sort of on the one hand, it's a classic design, coupled rangefinder. It is not the most ergonomic camera to use. It also had a big problem with the self-timer. If you use the self-timer, it would almost lock the camera up immediately. This is a Leica 3D, which is a little bit unusual. It's a 3C, which is the bigger base or bigger body style Leica. The 3C comes out just a couple years earlier than this, and it adds slower shutter speeds to the front, and it has a top shutter speed of a 1,000th of a second. The D is a little bit unusual in that it also added a self-timer. So, anniversary speed graphic. This comes out in 1940. It's the 50th anniversary of the company. The camera on the left is what the original version looked like. It also has a nice little flash attached to it. And those of you who are Star Wars fans, that's also the Star Wars laser sword, if you would. That's the original Reflex flash. In 1941, when the World War II started, the hardware, the shiny hardware on the speed graphic was painted black. After World War II, a number of companies come into play to make cameras, one of which is Nikon, or Nippon Kogaku. They produced the Nikon camera in 1947. It's basically a real milestone piece. First of all, this sort of companies and others like it were set up really to improve the Japanese post-World War economy. So it's somewhat styled like the Contax. Some people say it's a Contax with a Leica shutter. That's not exactly true, although it does use a rubberized cloth shutter. And you'll see it also has a coated lens. These cameras are fairly rare. Serial number wise, I think they number up to about 750. Although the way these were put together, it's rather unusual relative to the way we do things today. These were basically built complete and then tested. So the complete assemblies, and the cameras that didn't work were sent over to part of the company to repair them. Not all of them could be repaired. After this, something called quality assured assemblies would sort of take over, meaning you wouldn't have to do that. You'd actually put components in the body that you knew already worked. So that's the Nikon one. Reflex Super D was the last of the line of the Reflex cameras. This comes out in 1948. Again, it's a single lens reflex camera, fairly good sized camera, would be fitted with a coated lens. In this case, manufactured by Wallensack in Rochester, New York. Sort of a miniature version of the Reflex is the Hasselblad. Comes out in 1948. Victor Hasselblad his family owned the Kodak film distribution in Sweden. He was interested in being a wildlife photographer. His family, however, wanted him to run the family business. They had a camera store in Stockholm, Sweden. They sent their son Victor to Rochester, New York to learn the business, if you would. He had an office down the hall from George Eastman, would come to Rochester fairly often. So during the late 1930s, the Swedish government was looking for somebody to build an aerial reconnaissance camera. They had recovered one from a German plane that had crashed, and they asked Victor Hasselblad if they could make one, and of course he responded, well, we can build a better one. So first they made aerial reconnaissance cameras in the late 1930s. In the 40s, they decided to go into this sort of business. So this is a modular camera, somewhat resembling, again, a smaller version of the Reflex. It takes 120 roll film. It's modular, meaning that the magazine that holds the film actually comes off. If you look closely at this, you can see that it has a Kodak lens on it. The earliest versions of these cameras use Kodak Ektar lenses. 1948, Edwin Land introduces the Polaroid, which is an instant camera. So instead of having to wait to get your pictures back from the processor, so to speak, you could see them immediately. This was a big success. And this camera actually was donated to the museum by Beaumont Newhall, who was our first director here back in when the museum was first formed. Contax S is the first single lens reflex with a built-in pentaprism. What the pentaprism does, it actually makes the image upright and non-reverse. So it looks just like it does as you're seeing it. So the Contax S is introduced here, and you can see right on the front, it has that nice bluish looking lens, which is meaning it's coded for color photography. Contax 3A is an updated version of the Contax 2, fitted with a light meter and also fitted with a coated lens, 1951. The Robot 2A, another spring-wound camera. You see the large knob right in the middle of the camera. That's for winding the spring motor that drives the camera up. So you can basically have motor-driven photography. This was actually used by Edward Steichen. The robot makes a square size image on 35 millimeters, so it's 24 by 24 millimeters in size. The Reflex rotor comes out with a novel idea of using a series of lenses attached to the body. This is somewhat akin to what motion pictures cameras have been doing for many, many years. So this gives you kind of a fast way, instead of changing lenses, just spin the rotor around and get three different lenses. 1952. The Asahi Pentax 2B comes out in 1954 and has one really interesting feature. It has what we call an instant return mirror. Reflex cameras prior to this, after you took the picture, the viewfinder would stay dark until you advanced the film. In the case of the Asahi Flex 2B, after you took the picture, the mirror would bounce right back up so you could see to take the next picture. It's a huge improvement with SLR photography. 1954 also sees the introduction of the Leica M3. This is considered by many to be the best handheld mechanical 35 millimeter camera. And I'll put a little asterisk on there. The two-stroke M3 is easily identified by the shape of the strap lugs. They're kind of D-shaped. Some people call it the Buddha ear strap lugs. So wide base rangefinder. The original version, the reason it's called double stroke is you actually have to move the film advance lever twice to advance the film full way. So the asterisk on the Leica is the Nikon. It all depends on which camp you want to live on. If you're a Leica person, the M3 is the camera you want to talk about. If you're a Nikon person, it's either going to be the S2, which comes out about the same time. They're similar cameras. The Leica has a slightly more contrasty rangefinder, if you would. The Nikons used a thumb wheel focus, which you could also focus with the lens, which is a little bit kludgy. Anyway, they're both very well respected cameras in the history of photography. Last version of the, well, I shouldn't say the last version, the pacemaker speed graphic comes out in 1955, and it incorporates a rather novel idea of a couple rangefinder that's actually built into the body of the camera, supplied by Reflex, believe it or not. It isn't something that was an add-on later. Also shown with this pretty typical Reflex flash, but not the Star Wars version. The Super Technica from Linhof, maybe one of the heaviest, if you would, handheld cameras. It does have a handle on the side. I usually think of these cameras living on tripods, but it really was intended to be used as a handheld camera. They're pretty heavy, I would say about a third more than what you'd get out of a speed graphic. Rolleiflex 35 or 3.5E is the improved version of the Rolleif. So they continue to improve the camera since it was introduced in the 20s. This one has a exposure meter built into it. You see that kind of odd little arc thing right under the Rolleiflex plaque on the front. That is the light meter. The Pentax original meter model right here. This is the first Pentax that has the Pentaprism. So really from around this time, we start seeing a lot of competition and ingenuity in Japan. Kind of goes back to really with the Nikon, but a lot of other companies in Japan continue to innovate. So we're going to see a lot of innovation and competition coming up through this time period. Hasselblad 500C, the original model, the 1600F, used a rear focal plane shutter. So shutter would be two curtains that lived in front of the film. It was somewhat problematic. So what the 500C does is they kind of decided to scrap that idea, although the camera looks very similar. Now it has a leaf shutter that's actually built into the lens. Again, kind of a classic camera right there. The Leica MP, this was intended for professional photographers. They were serial numbered up somewhere around 500. This particular camera is in the middle 200s to, well, I said so probably around 233, I think is the serial number on this camera. This is a Leica M3 that's kind of been tuned up a little bit. First of all, you can see the unusual style strap lug. It has a manual resetting film counter. For some reason, other photographers, professional photographers, didn't trust the auto resetting film counter. They generally did not have a self-timer, although this one particularly does. The self-timer must have been added at a later point. The unusual lens on this is a 35 millimeter lens. The Leica M3 did not frame a 35 millimeter lens format. It would frame a 50, a 90, and a 135. So to remedy that, you could do one of two things. You could add on an accessory finder that would sit on the shoe on the top of the camera, or you could add this lens that was specifically intended for the M3 that has the goggles on the top that actually adjust the viewfinder of the camera for that. So kind of an interesting camera, pretty rare, by the way. So the asterisk with the Leica M3 is going to be the Nikon SP. This is sort of Nikon trying to out Leica, if you would. So it's a Nikon S2 in some ways that's been tuned up to have a viewfinder that frames, or actually separate viewfinders for 28 and 35, but bright frame finders for 50, 90, and 135, all in the same body. It also, with some modifications, could take a motor drive. Some people consider this to be one of the finest cameras also made. The Super Speed Graphic comes out in 1959. This is an alloy body, very lightweight camera. It's a redesigned speed graphic. The rangefinder is built into the top of the camera, sort of around the word Reflex on the top. It also has a leash shutter that goes to 1,000th of a second, which is pretty amazing for the time. The Nikon F, another milestone camera. The F is a modular camera. The original version was did not have a light meter built in. It was an add-on piece that would go on the front of the Pentaprism. The Pentaprism and its viewing screens were interchangeable along with the film back, so it could take a motor drive. It used a rather unusual shutter system. Instead of the rubberized cloth shutter like the earlier Nikons and or the Leica M3 used, it used a titanium foil shutter. So pretty well advanced. The Nikon F would be manufactured up until 1973, virtually unchanged. Well, they did add a plastic tip film advance, and they put a little slot through the prism release, but basically pretty minor changes. This becomes a system camera, and Nikon used to say that basically they'd never, well, there was lots of accessories available for it for that. The Contra X Bullseye is one of those interesting cameras. This has a coupled meter. It's externally coupled. It's that sort of bullseye in the center. If you like the phrase form follows function, that's sort of where this goes. Well, I guess the best way to explain this camera is you sort of have to see it to believe it. It is certainly fascinating to look at. You know, it was a very capable piece, had very high quality optics. It was not, at least in my opinion, it's not the most attractive camera I've ever seen in my life. The zoom lens, 1959. This is kind of where we are these days. The Zoomar was the first, 1959. This one happens to be fitted to a Voigtlander Bessematic. It's a very complicated lens design, and those days, the calculations for the design of the lens was all done basically on paper, if you would. This is one of the most complicated lenses that's ever made. It was not noted for being the sharpest lens that was ever manufactured, but it was the first zoom lens. Minolta starts coming along. They'd been making cameras for quite a while. The SR3 is a very interesting single lens reflex. Again, it shows sort of the competition that's going on in Japan. They're starting to have a nice sort of smooth look to it. 1960. The Pentax Spotmatic, 1964. This has, as the name implies, Spotmatic, it actually has a built-in light meter that actually works through the lens. That's where the spot parts. It's a very small section in the center of the lens. Canon 7S. This has the fastest lens that's ever been put on a still camera. This has the 0.95 lens. Kind of gets you the idea of again, the kind of quality that can be done in, it was done in Japan at the time. Basically, the 0.95 was done because various other companies, including Lights, had a 1.0, so they had to outdo them by going a 9.5. Canon Pellex, single lens reflex camera. This particular camera does not have a moving mirror. It uses a pellicle mirror, so the lens Actually, the light goes both through the mirror and some of it goes up to the viewfinder. 1965. Like M4, the M4 basically solves, if you would, the issue of the M3's viewfinder. So this will frame a 35mm lens without any accessories. However, some people's complaints with the M4 is you no longer have a clean viewfinder. You always see at least one extra bright frame in the viewfinder. That's the M4 1967. Well, not something that was really intended to be used on Earth, but the idea of camera technology evolving. This is the Hasselblad HEC. This is the electric camera that was designed to be used by the astronauts on the moon. Motorized Hasselblad, so motor drive on the bottom. Built specifically for NASA, 1968. Nikon F with the FTN photographic head. This is the last flavor, or last version, if you would, of the Nikon F. What the changes had to do with the improved light meter on the top, and usually this is considered among again the gold standard of 35mm cameras. Minolta SRM is really kind of interesting. It's a motor-driven camera built in 1970, but it does not have an exposure meter in it. It's really sort of unusual in a way. Hasselblad 500CM. This is an updated version of the 500C, improved lenses, more accessories, including the film advance crank. This one happens to be in black, really kind of unusual to see these in black. Most of them are chrome. So 1971 is when we start seeing the innovation wars, if you would, in Japan. So the Nikon F was Nikon's professional camera. Canon decided to produce one they call the F1. So basically their goal was to outjump whatever Nikon had, including motor drives that would do 7 frames per second. So very capable camera, 1971. So next year Nikon comes out with the F2. Basically their goal was to try to outdo the Canon F1. And the other thing that Nikon did at this time is they trademarked F2, F3, F4, F5, F6. So the improved versions of the Canon F1 were always called the Canon F1. So this is the Nikon F2 from 1972. Again, improved meter, faster shutter speed, goes to 2,000th of a second. Lots of features added to this. Slow shutter speeds, time to 30th of a second. Depending on your point of view, some people really prefer this as the most advanced 35 SLR in the mechanical world. Also around that same time, we get the Polaroid SX70. This one spits out the picture and it processes in front of you in color in 60 seconds or less. Canon EF. Now we're getting into automatic exposure. The EF use what we call shutter preferred automatic. So you pick the shutter speed, the camera would pick the aperture. I thought I'd keep everything chronological so you can get an idea of what was going on at the same time. So what we have right here is Steve Sassen's 1975 digital camera. Also at that same time, engineers from Kodak, Peter Dillon and Al Brout, invented the color CCD. This was actually intended to be used with a video camera. Canon AE1, Canon's version of automatic exposure. Again, you pick the shutter, it picks the aperture. Konica does the same thing, although again, Konica, you pick the shutter speed, it picks the aperture. Autofocus. This is a point and shoot autofocus camera from Konica C35, 1977. Canon AE1. This is again, we're getting into the innovations of automatic exposure. So this will allow you to do both aperture preferred or shutter preferred auto exposure. Canon's autofocus sure shot. Plowbell Makina 67, large format, if you would, or medium format 6x7 on 120 roll film. Nikon F3, it's a replacement for the F2. This is added basically an electronic shutter, electronically controlled shutter, and it also has an automatic exposure mode to it. Veronica, got to compete with a Hasselblad. This is basically the Japanese version of the Hasselblad. Canon AE1 program. Program means you could put it on program mode. It'll pick both the aperture and the shutter speed. Minolta has to keep up. They come up with the X700, basically does the same sorts of things. Nikon FM2, let's stay manual, manual mechanical, all manual camera with an LED meter. The Gold FE2, basically this is an aperture preferred automatic. We do have ones that are not gold also in the collection. The Nikon FA, this is the beginning of program mode, again, for Nikon, sort of what all cameras are using today, sort of goes back to this guy right here. Autofocus, Nikon F3AF, first automatic exposure SLR. Leica M6, the Leica with a built-in exposure meter. Affordable SLR, Canon, or the Minolta 7000, auto exposure, autofocus, built in with an SLR. Still video photography. Basically, Sony had introduced or talked about the Mavica, so Kodak returned. We've got to basically build something like this. This used what we call still video. It used kind of a floppy disk. The camera never went into production. It did have a complete system with interchangeable lenses, wrote to a still video floppy that you could eventually view on your television. Canon was the first to introduce it commercially with the RC701. At about that same time, Eastman Kodak Company started investigating the digital single lens reflex camera. So we have tactical camera, 1987. Konica gets into the still video mode with the KC400. Of course, Nikon has to jump in too. This is, again, still video photography. And finally, Sony comes out with the Mavica in 1989, although they had mentioned the camera in the middle 1980s. Ecamm, this is Kodak's single lens reflex DSLR with removable media, believe it or not. So it was a concept, didn't go in production. However, eventually Kodak would produce the Kodak DCS in 1991. This is the sensor for it. Basically, they took Nikon's body and put their digital system into it. Next year, they come up with a 200, basically incorporates this, that doesn't need to have the backpack. A tuned up version of the 200 that was used for the Associated Press. Kodak and Canon collaborated to put out the DCS 520. This is a 2 megapixel camera, by the way. Nikon was still building analog cameras. This is the F100, sort of a motorized version of a film camera. Leica M7 camera, 35 millimeter camera with auto exposure. Digital cameras, again, pocket size. This is the Diamage X 2 megapixel camera. Is easy to put in your pocket. Smartphones, the first camera phone is the Nokia that was sold in the US. 2004, we have Kodak's Pro 14M. This is the first full size, meaning 24 by 36 CMOS sensor. Epson RD1, the first digital rangefinder camera. Minolta E815, this is basically a flip phone with a camera built into it. It had a rather interesting feature. It had a burst mode. It's very difficult to use this camera, but burst mode, you might actually get one decent picture. Kodak EasyShare 1 is the world's first Wi-Fi camera, 6 megapixel. You could actually send the picture from the camera. Leica M8 is Leica's first digital rangefinder. The iPhone 3G comes out in 2008. This is sort of what has put photography on its ear, if you would. This has sort of become the point-and-shoot camera. We have the Fuji FinePix X100, one of the beginnings of the retro look digital cameras, if you would. Canon PowerShot S95, so simple that just about anybody, including my great niece, can use. Canon 5D is one of the cameras picked up Canon's version of the professional, or beginning of the professional photography. Olympus OMD, this is the mirrorless, the beginning of mirrorless photography. Somewhat, again, the retro style, somewhat looks like the Olympus OM2, OM1 series. We have the drones flying actually over the museum here. It's a Quantum 2 quadcopter fitted with a Hero 3 2014. The Nikon DF, again, sort of a retro camera. The DF is interesting in that it's a full-size sensor, 16 megapixel camera, so it actually gathers a lot of light. This is a camera that I like to talk about in that for two reasons. First of all, on program exposure mode, this is kind of getting what these things can really do. This is photographing a black dog named Titan running on a white background. Pretty much impossible to do. Program exposure autofocus. This image just amazes me. We also have a heron flying over the barge canal. This is a grab shot. Just again, DF program exposure autofocus. One of the images that amazes me the most is, this was about a year ago. I took my old 300mm Nikkor, put it on the DF, went outside, pointed at the moon, punched the shutter, and basically, what an amazing sensor, just be able to get images like that. So to try to contrast where things were, this is an image that I took of John Denver back in 1987. This is with my old Nikon F. This is basically T-Max. Just leave the camera set at f2 and 125 and go shoot under stadium lighting, which is next to impossible process and hope you get something. This is an image I took a few years ago of we'll say Brad Paxton's group with my smartphone. Just basically, just hard to believe the difference of what's happened in the last 30+ years. So I'll stop waxing on here and basically move on to the last image I can think of. This is Comet Neowise shot with my DF at Webster Park. And I have this image up for two reasons. First of all, I think it's kind of a neat image. I got the tail of the comet. This is about a 10-second exposure. And after I took it, I actually found out that there was clouds in it. So I'd like to use this to mention, if you're in the museum, you really should come to look at Heather Shannon's Gathering Clouds exhibition. It's really pretty amazing, kind of gives you the idea of how clouds have been photographed over the years. So with that, again, we thank the NEH for providing funding for this. And if you are so inclined, we would really appreciate your financial help. So thank you very much. And I will return this back to Kate.
Thanks, Todd. We have a couple questions, and I also welcome anybody that does have questions. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll be happy to answer them. I shouldn't say we. Todd will be happy. I will not be answering any camera questions.
Well, you're certainly welcome to kick in, Kate, if you like.
I could talk about Twitter. So the first question we have from Carla is, what is the Fulmer and division?
Okay, Fulmer Schwing was a company that started in 1900 making cameras in New York City. George Eastman was looking to add a professional division, if you would. So he purchased them, moved them to Rochester in 1907. So they became the Fulmer and Schwing division of Eastman Kodak Company. And they remained that way until 1926, when they were separated off by basically a consent decree of the federal government, and they became Fulmer Graflex and eventually Graflex Inc.
The next question we have is, what cameras don't you have that you would like to have in the collection?
Cameras don't we have? That's always a hard question to answer, because a lot of times the thing that I find most interesting are things that we don't have or that I don't know about. I got an email from a gentleman from Denmark about a week ago talking about an early 35mm camera that would have been made in Denmark in the 1890s. I was not aware of that. Our collection is really kind of hard to explain in some ways. It's a lot of what we have was donated to us by the Eastman Kodak Company. They set aside examples of their product, and they also bought competitor products. So we have a pretty varied collection, but there are some odds and ends that it would be interesting to have. Off the top of my head right now, I would like to have this is going to sit a little weird, but I'd really like to have a Honeywell Pentex Vismatic 615. We don't have one in the collection. That was actually the first camera that I bought. So it's always kind of a hard test. There's a lot of things. The other thing that we don't have a lot of are actually current professional DSLRs. Unfortunately, we just don't have the funds to go buy them. So those would kind of be the things that I'd like to have for the collection.
So what are phone cameras missing compared to SLRs?
Well, phone cameras at this point in time do digital zoom, but they don't have a physical zoom lens built into them. So and it also, so the areas where film or larger SLRs succeed over the smartphones has to do with the size of the imaging sensor and also the optics themselves. Now, the other thing that phone cameras don't do, you can add apps to them that allow you to be able to adjust the shutter speed, but on a smartphone, you are stuck using the lens aperture that they give you. So basically, that's the gist of it.
Was the Nikon D4 the toughest DSLR ever made? And which Nikon D series camera do you like best?
Well, let's see. D series that I've had personal experience with would be the D200. That was the first one that I bought. That was the one that had the last CCD sensor about 10, 12 years ago. These are all pretty tough cameras. I like the DF. Professionals don't really get that excited about it because it does not have a backup memory card in it. As far as the D4 or whatever they're up to, I'm sure they're more than capable. As far as toughness goes, that's a hard call. I still think the Nikon F is probably the toughest camera that's ever been made. They basically, you can't break them. Or you'd have to really try, I should say.
How and why did the various film size formats evolve? 110, 120, 9mm, 35mm.
Sure. Film size, if you want to kind of look at it, that's actually the canvas that you're working on. So larger film sizes will give you more resolution, so you can make larger pictures, bigger. It's just basically the same in the digital world. The bigger sensor is going to let you make a bigger picture. So it's resolution.
What about panoramic cameras? When did they come into play, like X-Pan or Wide Lux?
Panoramic cameras actually go back to the very earliest days of photography. Back in the fairly early years, you start seeing ways of doing it. So you can either have a wide angle lens, and there's numbers of ways to do this. You can either stitch together images, or you can use a moving lens, moving film pattern. So it's a vast topic. It's been around since the beginning of time, very beginnings of photography. So some of it is done by cropping images, formats, if you would, and some of it has to do with mechanics. So they've been around for a really long time.
I think we have time for one more. What is your recommendation for people who have a shelf or two of analog cameras?
Okay, I'm not exactly sure what the question is. Analog cameras are interesting in that you basically, if you want to process film, they have a significantly different look to them. During the pandemic, I was actually copying some of my old film images, and the film has a different look to it. There's no doubt about it. Analog, depending on the vintage, you know, you're basically going to get into the, I call it the F8 and be there photography. Whether you're going to guess the exposure or know the exposures, it's kind of a tough one to answer. I mean, depending on if you want to collect cameras, there's all sorts of things. I would say the best thing to do with that question really would be to ask me offline, and I can get more specific.
All right, great. So we do have some other questions, but if people want to send them along, we can share contact information. Some of these look like they might be a little bit longer, more extended, full conversation type things. So maybe we'll take some of these into account for future presentations.
Or again, if you want to send them directly to me, my email is pretty simple. It's Todd, T-O-D-D, @eastman.org. So we answer a lot of questions, and I'm always happy to do that. So that's kind of what we do here.
Great, and we can send that along as well to people when we do our follow-up e-news last week. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Todd, for another fascinating look into kind of one group of cameras. Todd is also going to be doing a presentation in December on another category of cameras. So we hope that you'll also join us for that as well. And again, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.